Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's exciting and very unique session entitled Lessons from Another Wild Winter in Texas. It's presented by Karl Rábago. My name is Michael Silber, Event Director of Inlet Australia, and we're the conference and exhibition for the energy transition, and we're delighted to present today's event. We're honored to have such a distinguished speaker with us today, and you can see his complete bio in the handout section on the right-hand side of your screen. But I'm compelled to share some of his illustrious credentials before we begin. Karl currently operates an energy consultancy, Rábago Energy LLC, based in Denver, Colorado in the USA. And he has more than 30 years of experience in energy and climate policy and is an innovator in utility regulatory issues relating to clean and distributed energy services and technologies. And I'm just going to give you some of the positions he's held over the many years he's been in this business. He's been the commissioner of the Texas Public Utility Commission, a deputy assistant secretary at the U.S. Department of Energy, vice president of distributed energy services at Austin Energy in Texas, and managing director and principal of the Rocky Mountain Institute. Before we get into the presentation, I'd also like to thank and acknowledge our sponsor for today's event, Salesforce. Salesforce serves over 500 energy and utility customers, assisting them with the challenges of the energy transition and helping them digitally transform their business models and place the emerging energy prosumer at the heart of their strategy. Additionally, Salesforce provides the cloud-native engagement platform on which utilities are integrating new and legacy applications and innovating with new services and personalized user experiences. Again, you can find more about Salesforce from the information available in the handout section down below. I'd like to say that after Karl finishes, we'll be joined by Jane Brown, who's the Regional Vice President of Communications, Media, and Utilities at Salesforce, as well as Joe Delaney, who's Industry Strategy Director for Energy and Utilities. And they'll be having a chat for about 15 minutes with Karl before we proceed to questions from the audience. A few quick housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be available on demand after this session. You can find it on our website. That's www.inlet-australia.com. As I've mentioned several times, you can find additional information from the handouts tab. You'll see that on the right-hand side of your screen. We certainly want to take questions from our audience today, so please feel free to send through your questions in the Ask the Staff a Question box, which you'll also see on the right-hand side of your screen. And we'll try to get to as many questions as possible today, but if we don't get to your question, please be reassured that we'll follow up with an answer after the session, in the days that follow the session. So with that said, it's now my honor to introduce Karl Rábago. Karl?
Thank you so much, Michael, and it's a real pleasure. I want to also thank the folks at Salesforce for making this possible. We originally conceived this as part of a broader conference, and I was sad when events took over and made that hard to do, but oh my gosh, thanks so much to Salesforce for stepping up and ensuring that we still had an opportunity to share all this with you. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to join me in this conversation. I will tell you just as a start, obviously I bring a lot of experience in Texas. I didn't just live there when I was a commissioner. A lot of my family is there. I spent a lot of years of my life in Texas, so it feels like what was my home. Now I've moved a little further north into the mountains. I was telling the team here that it is 36 degrees Celsius today in Denver, so it definitely feels like I'm back in Texas. I've been, because I got commissioned to do this talk by the good folks at Inlet, I have been paying attention to almost everything I can read about what happened in Texas in February of this year. And I'm going to talk to you about that, and I'm going to blend in a little bit of my experience from having gone through a similar event back in 2011 when I was actually a utility executive there in the city of Austin, and we had to deal with another freeze event, and generally based on my experience. So let's buckle up and get moving here as soon as I can see the see my mouse come up, and there it is. I'll start the show. So I titled this talk Reliable and Resilient Electric Service and Markets because climate change is what drove this weather event, maybe perhaps not the specific temperature on this day, but certainly the kind of weather that we're having. And as Michael said, I call it lessons from another wild winter in Texas. It's not the first, and it certainly will not be the last. But in the face of that kind of challenge, the real big questions on the table are how can electric service providers and the markets which are affiliated and associated with them provide reliable and resilient service as we go forward. So let's dig in. I'm gonna share a lot of specific facts with you just to make sure that we're all baseline on the same information about what happened. So let's see, dealing with some latency. Oh, I'm sorry. This is a slide and the slides will be available later on. Everyone who registered will get an email, so you can check out the details of the kinds of things that I have done and why I'm semi-qualified to talk to you about this. But let's start right in with the substance of Texas. The first thing to understand about Texas is that most of Texas is served within something called the ERCOT Interconnection. That's the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. It is a grid system that is isolated electrically from the rest of the United States and Canada. That is a feature of political history, not worth delving into, but it results in ERCOT often being cited as an interesting laboratory in which to conduct experiments and innovation, but also to observe perhaps, unfortunately, some of the errors when we don't quite get it right. And by the way, I will often slip into using the sort of the plural possessive we when talking about Texas, again, because of my background there. So here is the most compelling graphic that I have seen. It comes out of ERCOT and it tells the story of what happened. The big picture numbers of the Texas freeze in February were about 72 hours, about 54 billion US dollars, and many thousands of megawatts. So what we saw here, you'll see by looking at this graph, is that in the days leading up to Valentine's Day, not a very romantic Valentine's Day in the United States this year, you'll see that there was variation in load, and thermal plants were operating already with over 10 gigawatts of outages. We'll get to this in a minute, but a lot of those plants were offline for maintenance because temperature was not expected to dive as low as it went. Sudden decrease of temperature, which put an overwhelming load on the system. And unlike a lot of events going back to, I think, about 1989, put load on the system of long duration. This cold weather lasted many more hours, for example, than the one I experienced in 2011 that I mentioned before. And it resulted in the triggering of thermal plant outages. Those are the red lines. That number going up is a bad thing, right? As thermal plants were not available due to non-delivery of gas, due to the freezing of equipment. I'll go through the causes in a little bit. What was needed against the light gray line, the load forecast, became a problem. And load shedding, or the involuntary termination of service or cycling of service, was the consequence of not having enough electricity to serve people. The blue line at the bottom, wind and solar, tells a story that the #1 political response from the current governor of Texas, that this was caused by failure of renewable energy was, let's see if I can find the most delicate word possible, false. We'll get into the details of that in a minute. This was a failure of thermal generating units, first and foremost. So what is this by the numbers, the big numbers? These are all not meant to be eye charts. I'm just going to point out some really big things to you. But that last statement I made about what didn't perform and what did perform is substantiated in this data. This is ERCOT-based data, put together, by the way, in a source that's also listed with detail in the slide deck called Cascading Risks. The gas units at the top line there expected to perform at 48 gigawatts of power under an extreme scenario, expected to deliver 38, actually only came in for 30 gigawatts. This is what left the need for load shedding, was that these units, which were supposed to be the workhorses of cold weather, were not there as intended or planned. As for the other resources, wind was basically there, solar was basically there as expected, which is the critical issue under a security threat. The nuclear plants had some issues because, little fact, but a lot of the equipment at the nuclear power plants in Texas is outside and not insulated from the weather. And so it is subject to extreme cold weather. I should stress, I think this is probably something folks in Australia can relate to. Cold weather is what challenges the grid. Everyone builds and designs the electric grid for hot weather. The operation of the grid is supported by the fact that hot weather, lots of sunshine, is actually nicely correlated with solar production, which is growing in Texas. But it is cold weather when gas, which is the primary workhorse of electric generation in Texas, does not flow as well and is also needed for thermal load, heating buildings, homes during those severe cold weather events. And anecdotally, we are starting to see winter system peaks appearing across the South in the US because of the rush to gas that has occurred among the vertically integrated utilities and even the unregulated energy service providers. That is resulted in an excessive dependence on gas, which has resulted in a security risk in the winter, which has caused some utilities to actually increase their reserve margins and, ironically, to propose building additional gas units in order to meet the challenges of winter weather causing gas units not to perform. And that leads me to my first general comment, which is that in the Anthropocene, the era heavily influenced by human behavior, irony is not dead. Anyway, let's move on back to Texas here. And in February, the critical issue for everyone that understands how grid operations work is that you simply cannot let the frequency of the system drop below specific numbers before the entire system will fail in a potentially cascading failure. That's why the folks that did this analysis that I'm citing so extensively called it cascading risks. For you folks, I think it's 50 hertz, as I recall in Australia, but in the US it's 60 hertz, just so you don't get confused. And this graph shows how the frequency dropped. These are numbers in the tenths of a hertz of a cycle, because if the system really doesn't like to sit next to that design parameter of 60 hertz, and that a deviation below 59.4 hertz, 6/10 of a hertz, for more than about 10 minutes is what will cause that cascading failure. And what's really dangerous or problematic about well, first of all, what's really dangerous about a cascading failure is that everybody uses electricity, even those that depend on it for survival, unless they have backup generation. Second, and more pragmatically, what's a problem if you get to that point is that electrically it is very hard to restart a dark grid. You have to use what are called black start units, which are capable of starting even if the rest of the grid is not operating. In other words, they can produce their own startup energy. There's not that many of them. And along the way, those little circuit breakers on the tops of poles, breakers will trip, meaning, and many of which have to be manually reclosed. So it can take weeks, some people were theorizing months, to restore a grid that has gone dark, and everybody it just does everything they can to avoid that happening. As I'll explain when I talk about some of the human toll, that actually drives some of the extreme suffering that people experienced as a result of this severe weather. Where did it impact in Texas? So this is a good map to show you how much of Texas is covered by ERCOT. And as I sort of cutely said, the only places that had problems were the places that had lots of people and load, or the places that did not have lots of people and load. In other words, there were lots of problems everywhere. The dark areas show percent of customers without power, and you should know that that's of greatest significance there in the lower right, where you've got places like Houston, very big population center, the center of Texas, Austin, and of course the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. The shades are darker when you go out to West Texas because there are very few people there. So in giant counties were without electricity as a result of this, or at least had to suffer loss of load as a result of it. So it was widespread. Here are the big numbers. There will be no test, but so I can just call out a relatively few of them. But of the 29 million total households, about 10 million customers, 26 million of whom are in ERCOT, 10 million lost power at some level. While the high pricing of this event was about $54 billion, the actual total economic losses were at least 3 times, or about 3 times that much, because you can't operate an electric cash register, you can't pump water, you can't conduct commerce, and you do have the value of lost load. That's an acronym there, VOLL, all resulting from the outages. There were previous freezes, and by the way, a friend of mine who does weather modeling for Texas says there are likely to be at least 5 more between now and 2050. Gas production was down 50%. That's just the production of the gas, much less the operations. 30 gigawatts of outages for a state that has made itself heavily dependent on gas. One note about the 1989 freeze, which was really big. In the decade before that, Texas was up to 95% dependent on gas. And the big freeze in 1989, which came a year before I served as a public utility commissioner there, was for us a teaching point, a teaching moment, which said you just can't afford to be that over-dependent on one resource. All the other, lots of other outages were due to gas simply not reaching the power plants because of the infrastructure necessary to deliver that gas, to pump it, to compress it, was not working. I mentioned earlier on that some generation was off because nobody thought it would be a big time when generation was needed, over 14 gigawatts of that amount. The peak generation on February 14th, demand predicted up to 76 peak generation against a system that has a total of only 107 gigawatts, is what caused that stress. I already mentioned 5 minutes away from a total collapse, falling below that 59.4 hertz trigger point. On the other side of the generation, from my old friend Amory Lovins at Rocky Mountain Institute, is the demand story, which is that the severe cold added 35 gigawatts of peak heating load because people needed electricity and gas to heat their very inefficient homes. So the amount of load added by the cold weather was nearly twice the gigawatt total of the load shedding that happened. It's the inefficient building stock that caused this severe weather to suddenly add that load. In addition, and this is a point for our good friends at Salesforce have already started trying to figure out how to internalize and how to work with their customers to address, is that while there's the potential for customer response, it was neither informed nor engaged in this problem in Texas, because the institutions focus on the supply side, and as I mentioned, the summer weather. And by the way, this is just a little reminder in this graph here using data from 2018, that severe winter weather can cause sudden spikes in load. This is ERCOT's own data showing a 30 gigawatt increase in residential load due to severe winter weather. So this kind of answers that famous political question: what did they know and when did they know it? Well, they knew how bad it was, and they knew it before this happened, but they didn't do enough about it. The summary of all of that data and all these observations is the four biggest contributing failures to the problem in Texas was freezing at the gas wells, freezing in the gathering lines between the gas wells and the places where the gas could be gathered together for introduction into the system, the gathering lines, power outages, compressor stations, including, ironically, again, irony is not dead in the Anthropocene, including the fact that many compressor stations had enrolled in voluntary interruptible load programs to try to squeeze a few extra pennies of savings and therefore revenue out of their operations. So they got tripped when the power reductions came through the system. Yes, they actually shut off power to some of the system components that would move the gas. And then there were, as I mentioned before, equipment malfunctions at some power plants. That's what caused the problem. This scary long list of statistics is a summary of the human toll, while the political officials in Texas are still sticking with 151 dead. Surveys show that, in fact, more than 700 deaths can be fairly attributed to this event over the course of those 3 or 4 days in Texas, and the aftermath that came in a whole bunch of ways. The Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute did a survey of about 1,000 Texans, and you can see the list of pain here. In addition to the death, 3/4 of the surveyed people lost power, some for more than 2 days. They lost natural gas, even though Texas law prioritizes residential natural gas. In many cases where there is electricity required to operate the natural gas, they couldn't turn it on even if they had it. They used their ovens. They had to boil water because the water could not be treated because of lack of electricity. Some fled to other places and had to dislocate themselves as if they were in the throes of a typhoon or other severe weather event. A quarter of these people used their cars for warmth or power. Recharging phones. I talked to several people during Zoom calls who were sitting in their cars trying to keep the batteries going. Some burned wood, some heated things in their house, causing poisoning problems. So there was a huge amount of human suffering, which was not reflected, of course, in the prices paid, because because the Texas system sadly uses human suffering as the last level of resilience and reliability maintenance in the grid. It is related to a number of structural problems. The ERCOT market design, if you for the energy market sort of aficionados out there, is a scarcity-based energy-only market. I understand you in Australia have experience with some of the structure. The theory is that if energy is scarce, the price goes up, and that high price will encourage people to step into the market and provide energy in order to reap those values. There were problems, though, that in this market, that lack of available resource caused prices to go up. Regulatory bungling caused prices or required prices to stay up, and even though the system was not operating as well as it could have. Regulators, between the gas regulators and the electric regulators, are two different agencies who do not coordinate very well. In some cases, there was just lack of regulation at all. The lessons from previous winter events were not followed through with. The market design of the ERCOT a scarcity-driven energy-only market requires that everybody be forced to stay in the market in order that the pricing perform as intended, which means that utility operators in individual cities and areas had to surrender local control to the ERCOT market. And while I said I was going to talk about this earlier on, let me just address this point because it's a little story from when I was in Austin in 2011. In the city of Austin, Texas, which served about 1 million people when I was there, is now 2 million people. We had about, roughly speaking, about 300 feeders, electric feeders, little subsets of the system that serve a designated portion of the load. Of those 300 feeders, about 100 of those feeders, or a third of them, were ERCOT feeders, meaning that those were those circuits that if they tripped could lead to that cascading failure. So the local utility has to make sure that above all, the ERCOT circuits are protected. And that means that the load has to continue to flow there. They are prioritized. Why? Because if those ERCOT circuits trip, you could have that cascading outage. At the very least, you would have to wait on ERCOT to come reclose those circuits. And the pain, the political and practical pain of that is felt by the city. So us as a municipal electric service provider made sure that those 100 feeders, 1/3 of our feeders, were untouchable, and they always stayed up. A second third of the circuits were close to or associated with critical loads, hospital, elderly care facilities, and other such loads. Those had to stay up for public safety concerns. So now 2/3 of the circuits cannot be managed within our city in order to meet the stress of this extreme weather. That meant that any involuntary load reductions, and we experienced them in 2011, had to be cycled on just 1/3 of the circuits available to our management. That means the pain was not distributed. It was concentrated on circuits that were not critical load circuits and were not ERCOT circuits. That's a feature of the market design. It's a feature of ensuring necessary safety, but it really focuses the pain that customers have to experience. Texas also has a lack of connections. That very first graphic I showed you, not interconnected, operationally interconnected with the rest of the United States, and not interconnected in the sense of connecting to customers and the distributed energy resources that they could offer at these times. The load is inefficient because, as I stressed, the buildings are heavily electrified, but also inefficient in terms of waste. And then, as we've seen in the political response since, Texas is suffering from a lack of leadership in terms of addressing the real problem. What themes have emerged? What things might you take away? Well, there are dueling priorities. You need a big system of size. You need a big system to make a competitive market, the economists tell us. But the bigger the system, the harder it is to manage it. You are operating with an energy-only scarcity-driven market under the unjustified assumption that private markets will provide public benefits like resilience and reliability. They won't. At least they won't provide most of what you need, because you're trying to make people rich in scarcity, and that's contrary to abundance, which is reliability and resilience. There is, of course, the continuing neoclassical economics myth that price formation is rational. It is not, and has not been, especially in crisis. There may be a fair question to ask about whether a grid system is too big for humans to manage under these extreme crisis conditions, especially given the motivations of profit and, I'll say it, greed. The system like this rejects diversity in favor of homogeneity, because that's what makes an efficient commodity market work. But again, electric service is not just about a commodity market. And all of that culminates in a kind of irrational exuberance about profit taking that over the short term, that is inconsistent with what we would have called, when I was a regulator, the public interest. The solutions in quotes, not the real solutions. The politicians blaming renewables, the spreading of these costs over a decade into the future. But as I say in the parenthetical here, we need to think about pancaking. If this happens 5 more times, the pancakes will layer upon themselves, and electricity could be quickly unaffordable. The doubling down on fossil and nuclear fuels, using this quote from the old, I think, Groucho Marx movie, "Who you gonna believe, me or your lying damn eyes?" Those are the units that have the big problems, but the politicians are proposing that we increase our reliance on them. Regulation, which in Texas means just holding bureaucrats responsible, not markets. There will likely be some kind of capacity markets, but Texas will take great care to never say that word, because then they wouldn't be doing their energy-only market. And while we will privatize the profits, it looks like we will socialize the costs, which will add further sort of distortion to the market functioning in Texas. The real solutions: more interconnection, both interconnection with big sources outside of Texas and more of those big renewable resources that did perform pretty much as expected, better planning for these kind of severe weather events, better use of distributed energy resources. And a good friend of mine, Hala Baluz, wrote a very interesting article that I've cited here, arguing for a reliability system operator that does make some sort of sense, but probably off the table. I argue that all 4 of these are part of the solution. The questions we should be asking ourselves, and I offer that you might be wanting to ask yourselves, are: which resources did perform as expected? Because that's the definition of reliability. What was missing that led to these problems? Planning is the big one. What does the system reward, and is the structure designed to reward what you want to get out of the system? Which solutions are most flexible? Which meet and will perform even under the circumstances of these extreme weather conditions? And then what does it take to fix it? Leadership, not abdication of responsibility. With that, I'll mention that I left a couple of additional resources in the slide deck and some details you can look into from a great survey conducted by the folks at the University of Houston, where I once had the honor of teaching at their law school. So a little plug for the good folks there. Here's my contact information. Don't be afraid to use it. And Michael, what do we want to talk about now?
Well, first I want to thank you. That was one of the most enlightening presentations I've heard in a long time. And I'm hoping that when we have our live event in March, you can join us again. And I can tell by the level of audience and the engagement of the audience, it's very well received. We have we have a lot of questions from our audience, which I want to get to. But before we do that, I'm going to ask Joe Delaney and Jane West from Salesforce to join the discussion. And I think they want to interact with you and talk about some of the things that you said from their perspective. But if we can say in about 10 minutes, get to some of these audience questions, because we've got about 15 or so, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I'd like to get to some of them. So Jane and Joe, go ahead. I will leave the screen and come back on when you guys are finished with your discussion.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you very much for the opportunity to partner with you, Enlit. And thank you, Karl, for such an insightful and transparent presentation. You can see by the questions, we've got a lot of interested parties, which is very relevant to our industry here in Australia. So myself, I run our comms, media and utilities business, and Joe is my partner in crime here on all things power and utilities, and really is our industry lead around that here. And we're keen really just to unpack a few questions with you, and then we'll, pass to the audience. So I think thank you. Your hugely insightful presentation is very relevant to us here in Australia. I'm sure you're aware we have extreme weather conditions more, on the heat side of things. And we're keen really just to understand, what would you consider to be the key priorities for the Australian energy industry to ensure resilience against increasing, resilience against such extreme weather conditions? We'd be keen just to unpack that a little bit with you.
Yeah, I mean, in a simple and a very high level, the first thing to say is use all your assets, right? The big area of the ERCOT market is this. I'm sorry, it's sort of a neoclassical economist sort of, perfect commodity market dream, right? In which they focused on the idea of the commodity market for kilowatt hours as being able to drive all other things. And as a result, Texas policy has done a terrible job of taking advantage of, just as a simple example, the diversity of generation. Wind has succeeded very well, solar has started to because of other reasons, because it can generate lots of kilowatt hours cheaply. So you get a little diversity, but this 46% dependence on gas is really a recipe for disaster, right? Especially given how it performs. So use all your assets, but also use, the diversity is not just of the type of generation, but the scale of generation. Texas has completely ignored. In fact, one could argue that distributed energy resources are antithetical to the basic ERCOT model. And it has led me to comment that I think the ERCOT model has actually failed. You just can't pursue a single commodity to provide an essential social and public service like electric service by just focusing on commodity kilowatt hours. That's not what it's about. So apropos to the kind of work you folks do at Salesforce, we can't keep missing the customer. You got to engage the customer, figure out what the customer has, and realize that customers can bring value back to the system in terms of dealing with these crises. We need a much more sophisticated view of it. And by the way, here's the big takeaway in terms of operating a grid. The resources that are located at or near customers have the highest value, not best price, not least cost, but the value, the combination of price net of cost is in the resources that customers control, customers can deploy, customers are willing to invest in. And that would add, I think, the diversity and the functionality to the system to really meet the challenges that are coming to us in the coming decades.
Fantastic. Thank you. Sorry, Joe, did you want to add?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that really fascinates me about Texas is the similarities with the energy-only market here in Australia, the horizontal disaggregation of the sector as well. It was interesting, I thought, to hear what the new AEMO MD, Daniel Westerman, was talking about back at CEDA only a few weeks ago now. And this to me gets to the crux of what's going on here in Australia, which is, to your point about that distributed energy resource, here, we're seeing that on a per capita basis actually leading the world. and Daniel Westerman actually sets the target of, by 2025, the system here being able to cope with 100% renewable energy at certain times. So we're already seeing incidents of that occurring in certain states, in South Australia occasionally, but this is really a sort of potential game changer in lifting the goal up to 100% by 2025. I think it really emphasizes the points about, he emphasized the points about resiliency and data-driven planning, to your point as well, Karl. Streamlining grid connections is going to be critical in this as well. We're seeing a lot of state-based activity here around renewable energy zones. From a Salesforce perspective, we're actually doing some interesting work in the UK with National Grid around a very similar issue of actually how do you streamline the connection process, which is a major challenge here as well, as you move from a few dozen big central generators out to many hundreds of renewable generators. So that's a crucial issue, and one that we're working with National Grid on in the UK. I'm conscious as well of looking at things from the behind the meter perspective, as you said. So it was also interesting to hear Daniel talking about the importance of integration of the behind the meter solar and storage into the grid and aggregating that together. We're seeing a lot of activity in Australia around virtual power plants with led by some of the energy retailers. We're seeing a shift as well, potentially in the distribution space, with the potential of a more orchestration, smart grid perspective from distribution, from a distribution system operator model as well. So how can we stop pushing the challenge up to the bulk network and actually take care of more of the balancing out on a distribution level? So I think there's a few really interesting areas to explore here in Australia as well.
You know what? Just one other thing is just to think about the macro trends that are driving this, right? And you mentioned the virtual power plants, and Elon Musk is getting some press for having articulated this. And the California Public Utility Commission Utilities Commission has announced that they're going to be looking harder at how to take advantage of these distributed energy resources. I got to help put on the first symposium on the virtual utility in 1993. You know, we've been talking about this for a long time, but the economics weren't working in our favor. Now the economics are working in our favor. Now these sort of stress events are working the politics in our favor. As I mentioned during my talk, it's really hard to be the mayor of a town and to try to blame ERCOT when a third of your customers are suffering extended energy outages and don't have clean water to drink. You know, and they will not respond by trying to pass the blame to the wholesale system. They will look for solutions. Now they have more affordable distributed energy solutions. Now they have more intelligence solutions and customer engagement solutions like the folks at Salesforce are developing. Now they have the opportunity to in a word, defect. They don't have to take what the wholesale model gives them. And in the seeds of that defection, whether economic or technical, are the forces which some commentators have called a death spiral for this commodity-based system. So the challenge in front of utility system operators today and the regulators and policymakers is not how much longer you can get away with this crap, to use a coarse word, but how soon you are going to recognize the water rising at your feet and do something to introduce these functionalities into the electric service model. It does not have to be an erosion of profitability for utility shareholders. Indeed, it could be the greatest opportunity for shareholders in energy service companies we have ever seen, but it is not going to come from denying the reality of what's going on around us.
Fantastic. And maybe just in the interest of time, I know we've got a lot of questions.
Yeah, sorry.
And no, all good. And maybe just to sort of finalize our little question slot here, and then we can jump to, you know, the attendees.
Yeah.
And you've touched on it a little bit. Obviously, from a Salesforce perspective, we're all about really enabling the customer and the customer experience. What do you see are those key challenges and opportunities that incumbent utilities have around digitally transforming with a customer-centric energy market? You know, so that really, in such a disaster such as this, you know, we can keep the consumer, the customer informed and engaged. Be good just to unpack that a little bit in terms of challenges and opportunities, and then we'll probably jump into the chat, I think.
I think the very short answer to this is we don't pay for what we say we want. So if you want it, if you're going to have a capitalistic system as the background for the way you're going to get a utility services, and I am not arguing against it, right? Just then let's figure out how to pay for what we want, and what we want is customers who have resilient and reliable electric service. And what that means is take advantage of these assets, like I said in the response to the very first question. So I put a lot of hope as a regulatory geek, nerd, if you will, in the idea of introducing performance-based concepts. Figure out ways for utility service providers to make money doing the things you want, and not make so much money doing what causes you compounding and systemic problems. So that's what's your metric, what do you earn a profit on, and align those so that, what do they earn a profit on, align those so that their forces of greed will drive them in a positive way towards providing the service and the kind of solutions we want. That's at a high level, that to me is where you gotta go. By the way, that means pay for customer engagement, pay for customer empowerment, pay for distributed energy resources, pay for, you know, kilowatts of distributed energy per customer, per square kilometer, you know, per megawatt of served load, whatever your metrics are.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Yeah, this has been great, and we've got about 15 minutes or so, and we have a bunch of questions from the attendees, a lot on connections. So I'm going to start with this one. It's kind of general, and I'll throw it to Karl, then Joe and Jane can contribute. And this says, what can be done now for the problems surrounding lack of connections in the system? And what are your thoughts about the solution? What is the solution for the lack of regulation and leadership in Texas in particular?
Yeah, so the only real solution in Texas going backwards is political. You know, the sad but true statement that I used to say when I was in Texas is that Texas has exactly the kind of regulation and markets it wants. Otherwise, it would change them, right? They have the political power to do so. The question is whether we're going to have huge human suffering and crisis in order to instigate that change. Unfortunately, I will say that Texas also suffers under this sort of well curated sort of public perception that whatever's good for the gas industry is good for Texas. This is, you know, you guys in Australia, you have this experience as well. The idea that there's a public welfare benefit to ensuring the profits of businesses that extract from, you know, your resources and extraction resources. As long as they can make profits, they'll throw off a little bit for the public welfare. That, of course, does not work when you're talking about an exhaustible resource, because as the cost of extracting that value go up, the public welfare benefits have to go down. I'm getting a weird feedback from somebody, but so you got it's a political solution. There are people that are stepping up to do that, but I think more pragmatically, I think we could expect that we could see. Let me, if I, maybe you guys sample muting yourselves just for a second. Oh, it went away. But here's the little p political solution. City and town mayors and municipal officials are the ones who suffer the direct consequences. I would look for them to use the tools of individual customer empowerment, community customer empowerment that they can do below the radar on the commodity system. And there is nothing to stop individual customers or aggregated customers from solving these problems themselves. That could either be part of the solution or it could be a threat to the hegemony.
Thanks, Karl. Yeah, just to expand on that a little bit, and firstly, apologies for the car noise in the background. I think we're seeing some interesting opportunities as well around these emerging value pools that you indicate there, Karl. You know, how can we encourage more actual participation at various levels? And a couple of examples that spring to mind, obviously, with the rapid influx of electric vehicles around global markets. It's a little bit behind the curve here, but fairly convinced that once it happens, it's going to move quickly. How do you actually sort of integrate that offering into the market? We're seeing a couple of the retailers here launching electric vehicle subscription schemes, or in the case of what Origin are doing with the C&I offering in terms of fleet management. Really sort of opportunity to integrate the complexity of energy management and then potentially down the line vehicle to grid capability, which has electrification of transport then playing a big role in balancing the network. That's one potential value pool. Another one is around with the C&I businesses as you're looking to increase the opportunity for actually participation of commercial and industrial businesses in sort of maximizing their own on-site storage or on-premise storage and achieving some levels of energy arbitrage where they partner with the utility effectively to share the benefits of providing a service to flexibility markets. So I think there's some really exciting value pools to be tapped into.
I also, Michael, I realized I did not answer, and I want to just very briefly answer the question on interconnections. It is incumbent upon policymakers to recognize that frustrating interconnection of distributed energy resources and aggregation of customers through customer-focused solutions is an instrument of the abuse of market power. Right? It is a way in which an incumbent utility with it can exercise market power and prevent competition, or a threat to their revenues. And so policymakers just need to step up and recognize that if they truly want the benefits of competition, they have to prevent that power from being abused. There are also some just ordinary processes that in some of the states I worked with in the Northeast in the United States, just having monthly gatherings of those that want to interconnect, renewable energy service providers, rooftop solar providers, garage storage providers, and the utility people with regulatory staff in the room was a powerful way to make the conversations occur where people could say, hey, do you realize you're doing this stupid thing that makes it harder and takes longer for me to get a simple interconnection? And in many cases, the professionals at the utility go, I didn't actually know. I can fix that problem. So good old human interaction and communication is also a powerful tool. And then finally, the last thing I'll say is watch this space. Our Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has just launched a massive notice of proposed rulemaking, which will be addressing interconnection issues. And I am hoping that, I don't know what they're going to do, but boy, that record is going to be rich with ideas that you guys ought to steal.
Thanks for that, Karl. Here's a question that is specific to Australia, and it is our extreme weather events are typically the result of bushfires and flooding. Have you experienced these challenges that are impacted by these types of events, and what observations and learnings do you have?
I personally haven't experienced them except for the unbreathable air that we get from wildfires here in Colorado because of where we are in the Front Range. California is learning everything about wildfire impacts on the grid, about utilities not doing what they should have done for many decades or not being allowed to do what they needed to do. And we can decide where the blame goes, but it probably goes to both the regulators and the utilities. They're looking at very expensive solutions, undergrounding in many, many cases to ensure resilience and reliability in the face of those wildfires. The other cause, what was the second cause, Michael?
Flooding, wildfires and flooding.
Yeah. So flooding is something Texas is learning. Obviously, we learned. I'll give you as a positive example. Along the Northeast Atlantic coast in the United States, we had Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy. And what stunned me was that even 5 years after it, politicians were still trying to address the problems it created, in the sense of they didn't just forget, right? Unfortunately, the frequency of flooding events in the Texas Gulf Coast and along the southern coast is so frequent now that politicians are acting like they're just their routine. But again, the city mayors and stuff and other leaders are the ones that are suffering that. They are demanding local resilience solutions, right? They're demanding shelter-in-place solutions. They're supporting community solar and storage and aggregation solutions, all of which have to be enabled by active customer engagement in order to make them work. So I think we're seeing a bottoms-up response to those things. You can't change the weather in the short term, but you can change your short-term solution.
All right, let's get to the next question. I have two that I really want to get to. This one says, how did the U.S. government assist and support the people of Texas? But the second part of the question is most interesting. And what should the Australian government consider to avoid a potential grid collapse, especially as we head into the bushfire season?
Right. So some of those areas were declared disaster areas, and that meant some federal aid flowed in the direction of Texas as a result of that event. Unfortunately, the only reasonable assumption anyone should make is that there's going to be more of this, and that therefore those public coffers will be drained dry pretty fast, and they will not be able to provide all the help that one might want. So counting on the federal government to provide a solution, other than in terms of policy leadership or setting the tone by being good leaders, it may be economically unrealistic. What should the Australian government do? Well, to the extent that they can, like I said, they should sort of set the tone. They should provide support for solutions over the long term, not just short-term solutions in a crisis. In some cases, I hate to say this, and it sounds a little tough, but in some cases, the assistance should be conditioned on making fundamental changes, right? To say, look, we've done this in a number of places in the United States. Yes, here's some solution, but you have to adopt better planning processes. You have to adopt. You have to improve your interconnection rates. Apply a little performance-based handouts and not just pure handouts when it comes to providing the assistance you can. And then finally, the two other things: cross-pollinate the learning, because sometimes your states can be individual, and even when some of the same ideas would work everywhere. And the number one power of government, I learned when I was in the federal government, is the power to convene. Bring people together to figure out solutions. Just use that power to convene, to host a hearing, a workshop, a study process. People, they will come. Industry people come because they want to be on the right side. Advocates will come because they want to have influence. The government can convene. So convene solution finding efforts.
Thanks for that. This will be the last question. I want to let all the delegates and attendees who have submitted questions, we will forward them on to Karl and Jane and Joe, and they can answer them. Well, we don't have your details, so we can't really, but we'll try to post them on our website to answer the questions that we haven't been able to get to. But Karl, this question is, are there estimates on the potential of distributed energy resources? What was the potential in terms of how it could have helped during the event?
Yeah, so this gives me an opportunity to talk about another project that I've been working on that I'm very, very excited about. So I'll try to get through it as quickly as possible. But I'm working on a project with the businesses that provide community solar solutions in the United States. The coalition and look for localsolarforall.org. We have retained the services of this wonderful British expat. He's now a US citizen. He's ours. You can't have him back. Who has created this amazing model that basically looks at trillions of data points, 10,000 times more data points than your traditional utility planning model, and actually is capable of modeling the power of distributed energy resources in meeting utility scale requirements for energy supply and energy service. So instead of stopping where most utility models stop, this model is so powerful it can look down to 3 square kilometers, 5 minutes, and 1 kilowatt in terms of resource size. And I will tell you that this model is finding that we are way underestimating the potential of distributed energy resources to provide cost-effective solutions. Just to throw a number out there from our analysis, without even electrifying the rest of the economy, which by the way would triple these savings, we could get to 95% reduction of carbon in the United States by optimizing and coordinating distributed energy resources and save $500 billion on the cost of electricity by 2050. We've done these studies for California, for Illinois. We're doing a study for electrification that's going to show $1.5 trillion in savings by deploying and taking advantage of our distributed energy resources. The resource is huge. The resource is huge, it's untapped, and most of our old thinking is keeping us from thinking about how big it could be. And we need Salesforce, and we need utilities, and we need policymakers to figure out how to tap into that potential. And I have great faith, having talked with you guys, that you can do it. The challenge is on. Are we going to beat you to it, or is Australia going to lead the way?
Well, thank you, Karl, very much for your insights. I can tell by the number of delegates who stayed on for the entire presentation that they were really engaged. We had virtually no drop off from beginning to end, so that's great. In terms of the questions we didn't get to, I think what we'll do is I'll have Karl and Jane and Joe give me their answers, and we'll conclude it in an email to all the registered delegates afterwards, because there are plenty. So I want to thank everyone on behalf of Inlet Australia for attending today. I want to give a special thank you to our sponsor, Salesforce. As Karl said in the beginning, it's because of their commitment to this that we were able to bring you this presentation that was scheduled for our live event. I do want to say that our live event, the live conference, is now scheduled for the 16th and 17th of March in Melbourne. We're very excited about it. We think it's going to be a lively and vibrant event, one of the first power events back post-pandemic in this country. And we're hoping to, of course, have Karl speak at the event. Salesforce is a sponsor. If you need more information about the live event on the 16th and 17th of March in Melbourne, you can contact one of the team members who are displayed on the screen below. If you're interested in speaking at the event, please contact me directly. You have my details there as well. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. Special thank you to Karl and to our sponsors at Salesforce, and hope to see you all soon. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye.